Howdy, folks. This is Big Sam. Did you know that there's actually two different types of Mosin Nagant magazines? We're continuing our series today looking at some of the changes made to the Mosin Nagant production and its parts around 1936 and the simplification thereof. Today, we're looking at the simplification that was made to the production of Mosin Nagant magazines. Now, to understand this, we first have to understand how Mosin Nagant magazines were produced before 1936. And it was pretty much the same starting in 1891. However, there would be an extremely early variant, which we took a look at in a previous video. So if you're interested to see what the very first Mosin Nagant magazines looked like, be sure to check that out. However, for today's purposes, we're going to be looking at what the vast majority of Mosin Nagant magazines looked like from the early 1890s up until 1936. So here I have an example of that, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Now, one of the things you'll notice, see this little wear mark right here? We did another video talking about that. That means that this magazine used to have a sling swivel. So we already know this is a pretty early magazine. But the way that this magazine was constructed, and you can kind of see it on this guy right here, these magazines, before 1936, were actually produced using four main parts. You had this whole back piece here. You had the right side, the left side, and then this whole front piece. And the way these were assembled is actually really simple. In the front, they had two rivets, one right here and one right here. And in the back, they had three rivets, one right there, and about one right there. Now, some of these is easier to see than others, but this one's fairly easy to see, so I wanted to use this as an example. So, four pieces, front, back, left side, right side, and these were riveted together. That's actually a pretty simple process, but some simplifications were made to this. Now, one of the major simplifications that came around in 1936 was actually making more parts. And this is actually a very familiar theme, actually, with some of the other modifications that were made to Mosin Nagant production. More parts. And why is more parts a simplification? Well, and depending on how you look at it, it's not, right? Because you're making more parts, that's theoretically more complex. But what you're actually doing is you're making, instead of one part that's kind of complex and harder and takes longer and more manpower to manufacture, you simplify that out and break it out into individual components where each component can be made much simpler and much quicker by multiple different people at the same time. So parallelizing the process, parallelization is kind of how we look at it here. So let's take a look at a later magazine made after 1936. So what did they do? Well, instead of four components, we actually see seven main components here. The big thing they did was take this whole front piece right here, and instead of one piece, it's actually now four pieces. So we have three more pieces in total. We went from a four-piece design to a seven-piece design. So this whole front piece is actually four pieces now. And instead of riveting all of these pieces together, we now weld everything together. So if we take a closer look at this magazine, we can see we don't see any of those nice circular rivet marks here. Instead, what we see, especially up here, are these grinding marks. See these vertical lines going up and down? We can see here more grinding marks. Well, that's because they did these little welds here. And then after they did the welds, they wanted to not make it look horrible and, the finish be uniform. So when I move my finger over this magazine, it feels very uniform, quite smooth actually. That's because they ground it down to make it all flat before applying the finish, and we can see that here. We see the same grinding marks here. These are horizontal, but it's the same type of thing. So these are our two patterns, okay? So let's take a look at some Mosin Nagant magazines and just see what we can infer from them. We're going to be looking at some others today, but let's take a little bit of a closer look at these two that we've just been looking at. So this particular magazine we know was made after 1936 because there's no rivets, there's welding. And if we look on the bottom here, you see this O2? That's actually a country code for Hungary during the Cold War. So this magazine was actually manufactured by Hungary, most likely in the early 1950s. And we'll look at some others, but what we can infer from this is that the Hungarians did a very good job of manufacturing Mosin Nagants, as well as their parts, and they held quality in very high regards. The fit and finish on these rifles is quite nice for Mosin Nagants. So that was our Hungarian magazine. Now let's look at this magazine, which we know is a lot earlier. Well, again, we know that this is probably made before 1910-ish because it used to have a sling swivel here. And if we look on the bottom, you see this, we have an eye within a shield, as well as a C and a circle. So both of these marks are very indicative of the French arsenal Châtellerault in France. So this is actually a really old magazine. Now our floor plate here is not numbered, but one important thing to note is that the floor plate is actually not a part of our conversation today. That's a separate piece entirely. So this whole piece, we're not really talking about it today. We're focusing on the magazine body itself. This is an interesting topic for another day. So this magazine was made by Châtellerault, and here's another interesting little proof mark there. Another shield. I can't quite tell what is in there, but it's interesting nonetheless. Now, because this was produced by the Châtellerault arsenal, we know that it was manufactured during or before 1895. So this is a very old magazine. This will be the oldest one we're looking at today. And ironically, the Hungarian one is the newest one we'll be looking at today. But while we're here, let's take a look at some other neat magazines and see what we can infer. All right, well, here's one, and this one's pretty easy already because it has the sling swivel, so we know this is not going to be our later pattern of magazine. But what we're focusing on today are these rivets, and here we can see the same thing. There's one, it's kind of hard to see if there's one here, but there's 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And that makes sense because there should only be 2 at the front and our 3 at the back here. So this is a really early magazine. And from this, we can infer that this is a Tula magazine, probably produced sometime before or around 1910 because of the sling swivel. All right, so here's another one. This one's pretty beat up looking. Well, let's look for those rivet marks, and we don't see any. No little circular patterns. We do see some evidence of grinding, though. And a whole lot of other horrible things. We look on the back here. Oh, yeah. See that? You can actually see these are separate pieces here, the sides. We can see there's a lot of grinding that went on here. So that was probably after the welds had been done. Again, there's grinding as well. Now, grinding, you will see it on some of the early magazines as well, right? And that's just trying to finish it because, remember, these are still separate parts. And if you grind these down, you can kind of try to fool us and make us think it looks flush or one piece. But you really want to look at how the grinding's done. But the most important thing is that we don't see the rivet holes. And they did a pretty good job on this one of covering up all the grinding, so it's kind of hard to see, especially with all the grime on this. But the fact that we don't see the rivet holes is already a pretty good indicator that this was a later magazine produced during or after 1936. And this is also helpful to us because if we look here, it's so worn that we can't really tell who made this magazine. So this is a really nifty trick to use when you're trying to figure out exactly when a magazine was made, especially when you don't have any sort of maker's mark to go off of, like in this case. So this is probably made during or after 1936, and we don't really know by who, but it's interesting nonetheless, and we can learn things from it. All right, here's another one. We can see our seam here, and definitely looks like a later style, right? There's no evidence of riveting. Very, very nice overall fit and finish, I would say. This is definitely a later pattern magazine, a Type 2, as we'll be calling it today. Who made this one? So this is also interesting. So this is a Tula star, and the star means that this was made after 1928. But since this is a Type 2 magazine, we know this was actually made during or after 1936. All right, here's one. Here's another one. If we look, we have some really horrible tetanus, I guess, there. If we look here, here's our circles again. So 1, 2, 3 in the back, 1, 2 in the front. So we know that this was made, this is a Type 1, this is our earlier variant, right? And if we look at the manufacturer, that definitely makes sense because this was produced by the Tula Arsenal with this little hammer here before 1928. Because remember, in 1928 is when they switched to using the star. So if this was made before 1928, we know that it has to be a Type 1 magazine. We can also see a little Tula hammer there as well. That's kind of neat. All right. Probably the best example we'll look at today of a Type 2 is this really horrendous looking magazine, but I appreciate it. So you can probably already figure out that these aren't rivet holes. No, these are actually the little welds. And this is probably the most crude looking magazine I've ever seen, but this is a really good thing to study because it kind of goes to the extreme of showing, yeah, this is absolutely a Type 2 because look at all these really crude welds they did here. They didn't even bother grinding all of this down or anything. I mean, the fit and finish is abysmal on this magazine, but works just fine. That's the thing. The body itself doesn't really do a lot. You just have to make sure that the shape is correct. So I would personally say that, so we know that this particular magazine came off of an M38 that was demilled, and this was the serial number of that rifle, but we can see here that it's actually force matched because this used to have a serial number from a different rifle, but whatever rifle this originally went on, I would say it was probably a 1942 magazine, went on a 1942 rifle. We can see here this is made by the Ijevsk arsenal. So it's probably a wartime Ijevsk. And why do I say 1942? Well, that's when right around the quality control was probably at its worst, because at that point, remember in 1941, in the first 6 months of the war, the Soviets lost over 5 million rifles. So this was right in that time of, oh no, we're in a world of hurt. We need to make rifles, and we need to make them quickly and get them to our soldiers at the front. So that's really what that looks like here. And this is just a really neat piece of history. We can kind of see the kind of day the welder was having when they made this. Hopefully they didn't get sent to the gulag over this. But regardless, we're thankful that we have this here today to study. So a really interesting piece. So thanks for watching, guys. Hopefully this video is informative. If you have a Mosin Nagant, go ahead and make sure to take a look at it when you get a chance to see what type of magazine you have. See if is it the earlier style or the later style with the welds. Let me know if y'all have any prayer requests. And let me know what you'd like to see next. And I'll see you next time.